Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar with the CGF, Nestlé, and Earthworm Foundation on using satellite imagery to help address deforestation. It's 4 minutes past the hour now, so we can begin with a few housekeeping rules and the antitrust caution. So just a few notes before we begin. To let you know that this webinar will be recorded. We will be sending out the slides and the recording afterward. At the moment, all of the participants are muted, but we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation during which you can ask your question. You can also send us a question at any time using the window pictured on the right. There's also another possibility for you to raise your hand if needed, and we will give you the right to speak at the end of the presentation. Before we begin, to quickly go over the antitrust caution, so please listen carefully. The association shall not enter into any discussion, activity, or conduct that may infringe on its part or on the part of its members any applicable competition law. By way of example, members shall not discuss, communicate, or exchange any commercially sensitive information, including information relating to prices, marketing and advertising strategy, costs and revenues, trading terms and conditions with third parties, including purchasing strategy, terms of supply, trade programs, or distribution strategy. And with that, I will hand over to Ignacio to give us an introduction.
Hello, everyone. Good day. Can you hear me, Alia?
Yes.
Okay, good, perfect. So good day to everyone. My name is Ignacio. I lead the environmental sustainability pillar for the Consumer Goods Forum. So for those of you not that familiar with the organization or not that engaged with our work, this is a global platform that brings together retailers and manufacturers. Our purpose is to transform market practices and everything done through positive business actions. So we have mainly, we operate on 4 pillars. One of them is sustainability. Within sustainability, environmental and social. And deforestation, it's one of the areas of environmental sustainability. So back in 2010, the CGF committed to zero net deforestation by 2020 through a board-approved resolution. So as part of the implementation work that we've been doing, we have brought members together through commodity-specific working groups, such as soy or palm oil, in order to discuss best practices and those areas where the industry should improve, always in a non-competitive way. So many consumer goods companies like yourselves in the call today have policies against deforestation in your supply chains to help manage the risk on this policy non-compliance and to prioritize engagement within your supply chains. Some of you are embarking on different initiatives, also to understand the impacts throughout your supply chain, and more specifically for the case of deforestation, on the ground in producing countries. So using technical methods such as satellite imagery in this case to approach implementation puts companies like Nestlé in a very good position to understand the reality in and around their operation, and more importantly, to host dialogues with the different stakeholders involved in the area. So in essence, the real value of the program is putting detailed scientific data in the hands of people who can make decisions and be able to direct positive change on the ground. So we're very pleased to invite you to this webinar today with the essential objectives of sharing key learnings about the realities and complexities, of course, of deforestation as observed through the this particular Starling monitoring over the last few months. Nestlé will share the results of their engagement as well with suppliers and other stakeholders based on that data collection. and then share how to accelerate these actions within your supply chain, thanks to the data that is being brought by this system, while being realistic about the challenges that we face, of course, and the work that still needs to be done. So before I conclude and I pass it on to the speakers today, just for context, the CGF is currently reviewing its deforestation strategy. As I mentioned before, we had a commitment 2010-2020. So we're developing a new theory of change post 2020, in particular regarding the need to accelerate clean supply chains and how the industry can collaborate to achieve cleaner suppliers within that chain, including as well the concept of landscape approaches. So that's for context. So over the next few minutes, Emily Kunen with Nestlé, who is the global responsible sourcing for palm oil and seafood, and Robert McWilliam, who is the Director of Technical Services for Earthworm, will share with us all the key learnings from their satellite imagery project. So thank you all very much for joining. And Emily, Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
You're well.
So very happy to be here today to share the approach that we're taking to no deforestation and to monitoring deforestation risk. The approach that I'll share with you and the work that we're doing is definitely not a perfect approach, but we've learned a lot in the process. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to share that experience, particularly to the extent that it can lead to more effective collaboration among our companies, because one thing we've learned, and I know that you all have learned as well, is that this is definitely an issue that we can't solve alone. So to step back at the big picture of our approach, we take what we call a toolkit approach, where we apply multiple tools to addressing any issue, including the topic of deforestation. So for deforestation, it really starts with supply chain mapping and tracing our supply chains back to the point of origin. To take the example of palm oil, in the past, we were really focused on getting to the point of plantations. Now we're pushing further for concession maps and for smallholder mapping. Then knowing where our palm oil comes from, we use a combination of tools like certification, on the ground verification, on the ground engagement. We've been doing that for a number of years. And we've seen that with those tools alone, we are still challenged by scale and by the constantly changing conditions on the ground. And so that's why in 2016, we started to pilot the Starlink satellite monitoring system. And last year, we took that to global monitoring for our palm supply chains. We've also started in our pulp and paper supply chains with 4 pilots, and we'll be looking to expand it to soy and cocoa later this year. So this is an additional tool in that toolkit, but we still have to use the others as well. Oops, sorry. Before going into what we're learning from Starling, I know that we've talked a lot about different monitoring platforms, so I wanted to just give you a sense of what this monitoring platform looks like from the perspective of a user. What you see here is what I see when I log into Starling in the palm oil view. So we could switch it over to our pulp and paper view, but for the purpose of the discussion today, we'll focus on palm oil. We've uploaded in here all of the mills in our supply chain. So what you're seeing here is a depiction of the mills in Southeast Asia that palm oil is coming to us from. The circles with numbers in it indicate a cluster of mills, and if we zoom in, we would see the individual mills more closely. For each of these mills, then, we've set the Starlink system to give us alerts for any deforestation that occurs within 50 kilometers. And then what we're doing with that information is we've started to engage our suppliers. So we've shared with our biggest suppliers all of the alert information that is coming in around mills that they are sourcing from that comes to us. We can provide this information in a couple of different ways, either through Excel spreadsheet summaries or PDFs like this one that give a profile of the deforestation around a certain mill. So here you can see attributes of the mill, attributes of the deforestation, so how many alerts, an area of alerts within 5 kilometers, 20 kilometers, or 50 kilometers, and then the top deforestation events are highlighted. We are looking at ways to make this type of data to be able to share it in a more compatible way with other systems. So that's something that we are working on. And then those two previous slides I showed you were really focused on a mill-centric approach because that's the most complete data set we have about sites in our supply chain. But I just wanted to show that we also are able to look at concession level where the concession information is available. And instead of monitoring that 50-kilometer radius, monitoring instead inside the concessions. So here you can see purple outlines which indicate concessions. Some of these we're getting directly from our suppliers, but mostly we're getting them through public sources, and then we're working to verify that information. And let me hand it over to Rob.
Thanks, Emily. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. The next couple of slides, I wanted to run you a little bit through what is styling, for those that are not so familiar with it, and some of the information that we're finding or what the data is revealing. Essentially, when we started out thinking about styling, we were coming from a place where there was a lot of data gaps. We didn't have access to accurate forest cover maps in not only Indonesia and Malaysia, but in other palm sourcing origins, and we didn't have accurate deforestation alerts. And so what we went about in terms of engaging with supply chains with the member companies of Earthworm Foundation now is to do 50-kilometer circles using publicly available data. And unfortunately, that led us down some rabbit holes. We ended up engaging with mills that had replaced rubber plantations in their circles with palm plantations, which those rubber plantations were seen as forests. So we weren't so accurate in the engagements, and so we wanted to find a solution where we could be far more accurate and really focus on what counts to address deforestation in the palm supply chain. We were also missing data around measuring impact. So what has been the impact of 4 years of engagement in the palm supply chain on deforestation? And so these were key challenges that we wanted to address, and that's really where Starling was born through the partnership that Earthworm Foundation has with Airbus to use a range of satellite data to identify accurately where forest is and where forest loss is happening. We can move to the next. Emily's got control of the slide, sorry folks, and I'll let her move it. So in 2016, when Starling started, we used a combination of optical data and radar data. Apologies for the technical terms, but basically one is more beneficial in certain places where there's cloud. We used all of this data to try and find where forest was. We use all the fancy words that you hear probably every day now. So there's terabytes of processing power, cloud computing, machine learning, all this stuff. It's all fancy, but at the end of the day, if the data that comes out of all of that fancy stuff, for us, at least, if it's not actionable and accurate, then we're wasting time. So we've really focused on using all of that fancy stuff to get it actionable and to get it accurate. As Emily said, we started out with some small pilots. But a lot of the user feedback in those early days was, oh, I need it across my entire palm supply chain. So to date, Starling is monitoring every corner of the palm oil supply chain, whether that's in Nigeria, all the way across the Dominican Republic, or to Thailand, Cambodia, etc. And all of this is helping us to know where the forests are and where the deforestation is happening. We'll move to the next. So not only does it just help us identify where is the forest and where we're losing forest, but we need to get into why we're losing forest. What are those drivers? And so a lot of our work has focused on analyzing or processing further the deforestation information. Has the deforestation information been inside protected areas by a government in Malaysia or Cote d'Ivoire or wherever it be? And if that's the case, then how do we use the information appropriately in those cases? Has it been for urban expansion or mining, as you see these two examples on the screen? And we've also got into building experience around identifying deforestation related to other commodity expansions that are growing in the same area as palm, for example, rubber and cocoa. And all of this is helping us to think about what are the appropriate actions that a business like Nestlé or other businesses should take or not take, or who should we share the data with so that this data can be used in the best way possible to address deforestation. Move to next. Not only is it we're looking at the drivers of the deforestation in the sense of whether it's commodity mining or urban expansion, but we're looking at sort of the deforestation over time and space. So two things are really coming out from that analysis. One is that we see this sporadic, small-scale deforestation events happening across very large landscapes. And you know, we've put boots on the ground to go and identify why is that happening, and often that's linked to communities and smallholders changing the land cover, changing forests into some kind of crop to help their livelihood. Palm oil is clearly one of those crops. The second dynamic that we see is these very large and focused or very consolidated deforestation events. And these are very indicative of large companies opening up forest areas to plant commodity crops. In particular, palm has been a lot of evidence of this. This profiling of the deforestation events, whether it be a small scale or the very large scale, is helping Nestlé and Earthworm and others to engage through the supply chain to think about what evidence do I provide to the supplier. Is it, here's a large plantation development I can see happening near a mill linked to you, or here is a scattered deforestation events that are happening around mills in your supply chain. So this is just helping with those discussions and helping with guiding the mill on the next steps to take to address that deforestation. Move to the next. There's been, and importantly, there has been focus on deforestation that's happening within land banks owned by companies, for example, in Indonesia. And that is a good focus to have. But we shouldn't be blind, we shouldn't forget about the extreme amount of deforestation that's happening outside these land bank areas, as we've identified in Starling. Here on screen, you see 2016, the deforestation that's happening in an area in central Kalimantan. You can see the dynamic of the deforestation is very scattered, but if we move through to the next slide, we can see that scattering sort of picks up a little bit more. And if we move into the next slide to see where 2018 landed, it gets even further worrying that the deforestation that is happening is just really small. And when you add up all of these small bits, it's really encroaching upon or in being detrimental to the integrity of the forests that remain around these palm oil mills. If you move to the next, we'll see Q1 2019. And so that's all of that is really important for us to know. Maybe it's a bit of a data overload, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, yes, there is this issue of deforestation happening around palm oil mills that isn't necessarily driven by companies with land banks allocated by the Indonesian or the Nigerian or whichever government. And we do need to think about how do we approach that as an industry that's committed to no deforestation. And we'll come back to that later in the presentation. I'll hand it back to Emily now.
Thanks, Rob. So what does this look like when we're talking about Nestlé's supply chain and how we use it as a company? So first, it's important for us to really pay attention to the trends around our supply chains to be able to be strategic about where we engage and how we engage. So the first observation is that most mills are near deforestation. Nearly 100% of the mills are within 50 kilometers of deforestation, 85% within 20 kilometers, and 41% within 5 kilometers. And most of these mills are sourcing through dealers, from third parties. So it's challenging to be able to identify what's within their supply chain and what's not. Looking since the cutoff date that we use at the end of 2015, we've seen thousands of alerts. So Indonesia, over 160,000 alerts, which is nearly 400,000 hectares of forest lost. And for Malaysia, a bit less at 22,000 alerts of 63,000 hectares of forest loss. And as Rob was showing in a previous slide, we're paying attention to how that's distributed over different countries and different provinces. And then the point that Rob was just making is that nearly 70% of the alerts, most of the alerts that we are seeing near our supply chain are less than 5 hectares in clearance, indicating more of a smallholder clearance pattern. So using this information and the detailed information of how it appears near our supply chain, we've been engaging our suppliers. And so I just wanted to share 3 quick examples about the supplier engagement, because it's really more than just monitoring and seeing what we can see from these systems. So the first example is one that I actually visited a couple of weeks ago. It's the company that's in the top concession on this image, and this company was removed from our supply chain for deforestation last year. But after they were removed, and it wasn't just from our supply chain, but many global supply chains, they really embraced no deforestation. They did a moratorium, and they developed conservation and recovery plans. And we can actually see in this map that they didn't clear any of their remaining land since that moratorium was in place. There's a small red blip on the left side, and that was actually where they just moved seedlings in their nursery around. But we did see that there was large clearance nearby. So this rectangle towards the bottom is about 500 hectares. And so during my visit a couple of weeks ago, we went and we did verify that that was in a neighboring concession. But the importance of engaging the supplier and seeing the dynamics on the ground was more than just verifying what was in their concessions and what wasn't in their concessions. It was understanding the challenges of keeping the remaining forested land forested. They face a lot of challenges that we're seeing with many suppliers all over the world, which is from this remaining land, some of it was given to them by communities for development, and the communities expect the development. You can see that there is a company very willing to develop that land right next door, and the communities could take the land back, give it to the next company, and have it cleared. There's also the challenge that the government wants the development, and so if they don't develop the land, the government can also take it back and give it to another company like the one next door for the clearance. So it's really important. It's been really important for us to engage them to understand that, learn about the importance of having landscape type approaches in this area that find really sustainable development strategies and do sustainable land use planning. And it was also important for us to see here that suspension really can't be the end of the line in the deforestation strategy. We have to really support the recovery plans and support that collaborative solution building. The second example is a mill in our supply chain, which is shown here in the middle. And you can see in the light purple line around it, the concession that's attached to that mill. This case we are currently investigating because what we're looking at around it is a 50-kilometer radius where we see about 14,000 hectares cleared since the cutoff date. And the mill is sourcing through dealers, and you can even see this road in the middle leading directly from the mill to one of the cleared areas. And through our investigations, we've heard a rumor that there may be a relationship between this company and the company owning the adjacent land. But what we're getting back and what we've heard from many of the mills that we've engaged is, well, how can I possibly prove this isn't connected to me? I can only prove the positive. I can only prove what is in the supply chain, not what's not. And so there's really a need for tools for mill level monitoring of FFB and making sure that's not associated with deforestation. This is quite a large operation, but there's many more small independent mills where that struggle is even greater. The other lesson that we're having here is that the concession maps don't tell the whole story. And so it's important for us, again, to understand the dynamics around the concession. And then the third example, going back to what Rob was just highlighting at the end there, is about the dynamics around smallholder deforestation. This is one of the most typical scenarios that we are seeing. So on the screen, you see about 100 kilometers radius out from the mills, and nearly, I've lost the number, nearly 16,000 hectares of clearance, almost all of which is less than 5-hectare increments. And when we've engaged suppliers on this, the answer consistently is smallholders are not a part of our no deforestation strategy, which we understand because it's not a part of anyone's no deforestation strategy, and it's very tricky, but it's definitely an area where we're seeing very clearly that we need to engage on. So I realize that this is all a bit daunting and we're highlighting a lot of challenges here, but to us, this is really a positive thing because those challenges were always there. We just weren't seeing them. We have a 9-person responsible sourcing team at Nestlé, but when it comes to each category, we have less than 1 person working on it. So I cover palm oil, but I also cover seafood. So we aren't able to be everywhere all of the time. And so before we had this tool, we were really stuck in engaging our direct suppliers in conversations about their overarching frameworks. And now we're allowed to really jump into the specific cases, and we're having very, very different conversations as a result. And in fact, we've jumped 2 steps ahead in the process, and we're able to start, I feel like, addressing the issue. So to summarize the lessons that we've learned in this first 6 months, like I just mentioned, engaging suppliers on specific cases is very different than engaging them on broad frameworks. As you saw in the second example, concession maps are only part of the solution. The third lesson is that looking at all of the no deforestation tools or all of the deforestation monitoring tools that are out there, we're seeing a lot of value that they all add. And there's also a bit of debate about, okay, which is the one that we should be using. But the reality is, if we have all of those tools applied at their full capacity, we're still not really enabled to cover all of the risk. So I think the conversation really should be shifting to how do we get these tools to complement one another and make sure that we have the greatest coverage between all of them that we can have. Then we're seeing that we're missing verification and management tools like the mill level FFB control systems, the smallholder strategy, and effectively jurisdictional approaches where we look across industries and engage different types of stakeholders. And then lastly, we are being really challenged by, in several cases, being the only company asking about certain events, because even when we present some of these images and the evidence that we have from Starling, because this is the first time that companies in our supply chain have heard about these events, the perception is still that they must be low risk. So I'm going to give it back to Rob to talk about some of the solutions.
Thanks, Emily. So yeah, I've got two that I'd like to talk about. But firstly, I'd start off by saying that clearly data is not the problem. Whether it's Starling or whether it's other solutions that are out there, everyone has got their favorite if they see a benefit in for whatever reason. So clearly we've got the tools to know what is happening, where it's happening. I think the challenge now is about what action do we take with the resources, and more limited resources, if we're honest with each other, to create change. And I'd like to talk about 2 potential opportunities, and Emily's touched on that as well in that previous slide. So if we move to the next, we'll go into the first one. And I think the first one's really around smallholders. Clearly, we to reiterate that statistic, so we over the period between end of 2015 until March this year, in Indonesia and Malaysia, 70% of the deforestation was linked to deforestation events less than 5 hectares in size. Very sporadic and very spatially spread, but always within a catchment area of a palm oil mill. So that clearly sets the tone for a significant challenge. However, we've got to find the way forward. Obviously, palm plays an important role for smallholders, for their development, and smallholders play an extremely important role in supplying the palm industry with fruit. And I think that will only increase. You know, a lot of companies in the upstream of the supply chain, the integrated ones, are seeing that kind of cliff where their access to further land is difficult to achieve. And therefore, how do I support smallholders to go about expanding or developing new areas of palm plantation to supply my infrastructure, my mills, and my refineries? But where does styling fit into this? And I think where the styling piece fits in initially is to help with the identification of where forest areas are and where the forest loss is happening, in particular focusing on areas of forest that are more akin to high carbon stock approach and the high conservation value toolkit. These are obviously two tools that have been used by no deforestation commitments to operationalize on the ground, and very credible, reputable tools. What we struggle with is how we scale those tools to entire provinces, islands of Indonesia, or entire countries, so that we can focus our limited resources around key forest areas that are going to be high carbon stock or high conservation value, and support the palm oil mills in those areas, on those forest frontiers, to engage with their existing smallholder base and to look at how they create FFB control systems that Emily mentioned before, or to start engaging and finding solutions for those smallholders that are going to not necessarily leave them in poverty, but to build alternative livelihood strategies that don't result in the business as usual palm expansion. There's a number of examples that we've worked on at the Earthworm Foundation of working with smallholders across Indonesia and Malaysia and other parts of the palm supply chain, where we're engaging to support not only the improvement of their yields, achieve certification in some instances, but also what are the alternatives? What is going to bring an equivalent amount of income or a similar level of income that doesn't result in further deforestation behind the back gate. So I think there's a huge opportunity there in terms of where we targeted our resources around these forest frontiers that styling can help identify, but then also the collaborative opportunity that brings for companies on this call, companies across the supply chain on palm, to really focus those resources on the mills that matter and the smallholders that are encroaching into these key forested areas. We can secondly move to the next slide. It is no doubt something that you've all heard of, and so I don't want to give a 101 on jurisdictional landscape approaches, but clearly this is part of the solution box going forward. If it's not cleared for palm, it's cleared for rubber. If it's not cleared for rubber, it's cleared for cocoa. If it's not for that, it's for something else. And on it goes. And I think taking a more holistic strategy that also works closely with the government, whether that be a district, provincial, or central, federal levels of government, is very much needed. We've got one example where we're working in a number of landscapes across the world, but one example in particular in Aceh, an area where we have the Loser ecosystem, if people are familiar, important for a number of biodiversity reasons, and large tracts of lowland tropical rainforest still remain, but are under pressure from expansion of various commodities, including palm. In Aceh, in a particular district called Aceh Tamiang, the district government, it often lacks any data about what's going on in the district in terms of forest cover and forest cover change or deforestation. And that makes their implementing their regulations, implementing legislation, implementing laws very challenging. But in this case, we were able, through private sector collaboration, and a number of businesses supported that, to provide styling data to the district government so that they could revise their spatial land use planning. And then look at that with the lens of no deforestation, the lens of high carbon stock assessments and high conservation value assessments, but tied in with the support of alternative livelihood strategies that are also being developed. So I think there's a very good opportunity there to work together to identify where are these key forested areas that we can support smallholders, and go beyond just a smallholder to scale it to a government level, whether that's district or provincial, provide up-to-date data, work hand in hand to guide development in a way that protects those high conservation and high carbon values, but doesn't deprive the development opportunities and the tax revenue opportunities that the government was expecting originally. So I think they're two areas where I think a lot more collaboration could be fostered. Back to you, Emily.
Thanks. So we wanted to just end on opportunities for collaboration. We've talked about all of these already throughout the presentation, but just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of companies that are working on this. There's a lot of tools being applied to this issue, and there's an opportunity having the data that we have from Starling or from any of the other satellite monitoring tools that are out there to really be strategic collectively about how to make sure we have the greatest coverage of impact and apply the right tools in the right places, making sure that the monitoring tools are, which we believe are complementary, really have the systems to be able to communicate with one another, making sure we have as broad as possible on the ground engagement, finding those solutions for smallholders, and working on landscape approaches together. So let me stop there. And I guess, are there any questions, or let me hand it back over to the CGF team to manage that?
Thanks, Emily. Yep, so just seeing if anyone has any questions for Emily and Will. Again, I remind you that you may send a question through the question box or raise your hand.
It's Ignacio here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So while people are thinking on the questions, how long did it take you to set up the system and link it to your supply chain?
Rob, do you want to talk about that since you were there from the beginning?
Just for companies to have an idea on how feasible, because this, obviously you're a very big organization, but I'm thinking on medium or smaller companies operating in consumer goods, confectionery, whatever that they use, palm oil as well, but how easy, difficult it is to set up for a smaller company, and how long will it take approximately?
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed.
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so not long at all. So it took us some time to build the infrastructure to house the supply chain information, you know, and create and process all the terabytes of data, satellite images, etc., to create the base maps, which is the forest, plantation, etc., what you see on the ground today, and then the monitoring. So that just sits there, and that's ready to be used whenever. If a new business comes to, or a new user, it may not be businesses, by the way. We do have other users, as I mentioned, government and even NGOs that we're investigating with. But if a new user comes along, then setting up their supply chain in the system happens very quickly. There's a process to ensure that the supply chain information is clean, and that the mills are corresponding to the master mill list that currently exists. And once that's done, it's uploaded into the system, and a login is provided, and the business is away. I think the point that Emily was making before, and I think that you're also making, Ignacio, is that we were faced with a challenge at Starling as well, where we have small businesses. They've got very little time or resources or people to put into Palm to follow up with suppliers, etc. So we didn't want to bombard people with all of that data and say, here, you go figure it out. What we really want to work on is with your supply chain, where the deforestation is happening, and give you targeted guidance on where you should focus your resources. Because quickly you can become quite chaotic and go everywhere and have very little impact. So what we're really doing is training all of that data and tying it to the supply chain so that really focused actions can take place. Even if you're just sitting there and you've only got 50% of your time on palm, or even less, 10% of your time on palm, that's what we aim to achieve.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Well, we remind you that if you do want to ask a question, you can always send us an email at the Consumer Goods Forum, and we can pass it on to Emily and Rob, and then send you a response. And we will also be sending out the recording and the slides to everyone participating in the webinar and the wider CGF membership. Oh, I'm seeing a question from, oh no, it was a comment. Thanks, Hugo. All right, well, with that, if Ignacio or Emily or Rob, if you have any closing remarks before we say goodbye.
Just say thank you. Go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
I think we're going to say the same thing, but yeah, just thanks, and definitely open to any follow-up questions people have later on and going in more detail on anything.
Actually, we just received one question from Wong Piron, I believe, from Cargill. The question reads, specific to the slide on deforestation by smallholders from 2016 to 2018, has there been any engagement carried out in this area? So that's the slide on deforestation by smallholders from 2016 to 2018.
No, so we've just started talking to our suppliers sourcing from that area about what the options are and how to build an approach to the smallholders there, but not yet engaging them.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I would just echo Emily, say thank you to everyone for joining and hearing all the great work we're doing over here, but and to also echo that if there's any follow-up questions, we're also happy to get on the phone and talk about what we're doing and how it could be helpful and how to move forward. Thank you again for your time.
All right. Well, with that, thank you as well for presenting your work, and we will follow up soon with the presentation recording and the slides. Wishing everyone a good week. Thank you for joining, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.